How are we as a community? How are we responding to this social and political moment? So much to discuss, and please stay tuned for more exciting announcements very soon about how you can get involved and engaged in the Conference on Democracy this year. It is now my honor to introduce Lawrence Meyer and Congressman Jared Huffman. Lawrence Meyer is a former reporter for the Washington Post and former editor of the Washington Post Weekly Edition. He spent 32 years at the Washington Post, where he covered the attempted assassination of Governor George C. Wallace, the Watergate break-in trial, Senate Watergate hearings, and impeachment proceedings against President Richard Nixon. In addition, he has published 4 books, and his second novel, False Front, was nominated for the American Book Award. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Meyer to Marin Academy. Congressman Jared Huffman graduated magna cum laude from UC Santa Barbara and then graduated cum laude from Boston College Law School. He has served as the director of the Marin Municipal Water District, worked as senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and represented the North Bay for 6 years in California Assembly, where he sat as the chair for the Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee. Huffman now represents California's 2nd Congressional District, Golden Gate Bridge to Oregon border. His first term in Congress started in November 2012. He works on the Committee of Natural Resources, the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure, the Select Committee of the Climate Crisis. In the 116th Congress, he chairs the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, with jurisdiction over federal water projects, fisheries management, coastal zone, oceans policy, and wildlife and endangered species. As I turn things over to our moderators, Seniors Sophie H-C and Luke Chase, please join me in welcoming Congressman Huffman to Marin Academy.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. As you walked in, you got an index card and pens to share with your neighbors. If you would like to ask a question to our panelists, please write it on the card and then pass it down to the front row to one of our student ushers, who will collect the questions. We will read as many as we have time for towards the end of the event. Thank you. And now to address some issues to our very special guests. This question is for you first, Mr. Meyer, and then we invite Congressman Huffman to respond. Watergate was one of those events that initially seemed inconsequential, but as we know, the story turned into one of the most important political events in American history. What were the challenges of chasing a story that took more than a year to unfold? And what, in your view, was the most important moments? Do they provide any guidance on our present situation? Do they provide any guidance on our present situation?
Yes. I think from a repertorial point of view, one of the main challenges of the Watergate at the beginning, when it was clear that it was more than just a random burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters, was the concerted opposition and hostility that we faced from the White House, and the kind of loneliness that was the rest of the media, other than the Washington Post, was slow to get on board and do any kind of reporting about the Watergate break-in, and so that it was really the Post for quite some time out there alone, and then we were joined by the New York Times and eventually by CBS, but it was a very slow to gain any kind of momentum. In fact, even at the Washington Post, there was resistance to the story because the story was being handled by the city desk of the Post. I was a reporter on the city desk. Woodward and Bernstein were reporters on the city desk, and we were all kind of young and junior. And the national desk was finding that because of our reporting, the Nixon White House was giving exclusive stories to other newspapers just to embarrass us and to cut us off from information. And that wasn't pleasant. And the national staff kind of disparaged our reporting and didn't quite understand what was so important about what we were doing. And just to give you one quick example, the Watergate break-in trial occurred in January of 1973, and President Nixon was inaugurated on January 20th of 73, and when the end of the trial came at the end of January, the national editor wrote a memo to the national staff saying, now that the inauguration and Watergate are behind us, we should get on with our coverage. And of course, that was only the beginning and not the end. I just want to say that, to my mind, one of the most important aspects of what we're experiencing now is reminding us again about the importance of character. We had 3 impeachment proceedings in my lifetime, and in each case, the president who was being investigated exhibited a character flaw or flaws. And it's a reminder again how important it is to be careful and really scrutinize carefully the candidates who are running for office to make sure that you pick somebody who has the right character and temperament to serve as president.
Thank you.
I have a quick follow-up question for that. So, do you think that Watergate struggled to gain momentum because the White House was doing such a good job at covering it up, or because it was just too far-fetched?
Well, it wasn't. The White House did a fair job at the outset of holding back information, and at the outset it really didn't look like it was kind of a bizarre event, as burglary of the Democratic National Committee. I don't want to go into this too much at this point, but ultimately it wasn't the Watergate break-in which was the undoing of the White House. There was a whole bunch of other stuff that they were afraid was going to come out. So that's why they, from their perspective, they thought that if they could just quash this, they'd be okay. Woodward and Bernstein spent a lot of time going around, knocking at doors late at night, and that's slow going, and if you're an investigative reporter, you have to get used to the idea that a lot of doors are going to be slammed in your face. And they were. Along the way, they picked up information, and we had some good stories, but it wasn't until March of 1973 when Judge Sirica, who was the presiding judge in the Watergate break-in trial, read James McCord's letter in which he said that perjury had been committed at the trial, that hush money had been paid, and that there were more people involved in the conspiracy than the ones who had stood trial for the break-in. And that was the first really big moment in terms of opening the story up.
Thank you. This next question is for you, Congressman Huffman, and then if Mr. Meyer wants to respond or has anything to add, feel free. Given that President Trump has experienced significant controversies regarding the use of executive power numerous times during his term thus far, Why do you think that it is important he faces the consequences of his actions for this particular incident rather than others? To kind of rephrase that, what is it about this incident and the connected issues that seem to be arising daily as investigators dive deeper that is different from others that sets it apart?
So I'll get my microphone working. There we go. I will speak to that, but I wonder if I could just take a moment of personal privilege and tell you how honored I am to be on a panel with a great journalist like Larry here. I doubt that at any time in the history of this country, his profession has been more maligned, and it's quite a moment, I think, to even be in journalism, but Larry is a living reminder of the value of investigative journalism, especially. And by the way, Woodward and Bernstein got a lot of the historic credit, but you were right there, Larry, on the front line, digging into all of the same stuff and covering all of these critical stories that at the time saved our republic. When I was studying political science like 3 decades ago, we studied the imperial presidency of Richard Nixon as the ultimate stress test for our republic, and we talked about all these different ways in which the checks and balances of our system stood up and actually worked, and yes, our free press was a huge part of that. I would say today we face tests that are even greater than what Larry was reporting on. He talked a little bit about the cover-up, and it has been said by historians that the main reason Nixon went down was because what could have been a manageable little misdemeanor turned into something more than that because of the cover-up. I would say in this situation, I'll get directly to your question in just a second, you have a much more significant breach of trust, abuse of power, and a cover-up that is equally troubling. So I'm going to argue, as we continue this conversation, that this is a far more serious test of our republic and a far more serious offense by President Trump than even what Larry and his colleagues at the Post reported on in the 1970s. Now, what's different about this Ukraine scandal and all of the previous executive abuses of power? And the way you phrased the question initially suggested, why should we hold him accountable for the Ukraine issues but not the other things? And I would say it's not a choice. You have to hold president, if you're doing your job in the Congress, and that's the oath I took, you hold presidents accountable for all violations of the law and all abuses of their authority. And I've got a list as long as my arm that I'm interested in holding this president accountable for. From the obstruction that's revealed and reaffirmed really by the Mueller report to other abuses of power, actions like overriding his national security advisors to give security clearances to family members. I mean, it's stuff that we've almost lost sight of because they've been so diluted by this steady flow of crazy stuff that this president has served up for us in the last 3 years. So I think all of it has to figure into accountability. But the reason this Ukraine scandal is different, and even though my red lines were crossed a long time ago, those who were holding out, those who were not yet convinced, even they found their red lines crossed by this Ukraine scandal, I would say for 2 reasons. One, because it involves our national security, and it is such an egregious breach of the president's oath of office and his obligation to look out for our national security interests, to elevate his personal political interests in such a craven way. And second, it's all right there. We don't even have to take the secondhand account of a whistleblower as the only evidence. We actually have it from the White House's own direct readout of the conversation with the Ukrainian president, and we're now seemingly every single day getting confirmation from one witness after another. In fact, it seems to go deeper and deeper now, and even though you don't need a quid pro quo to have impeachable abuse of power in a situation like this, it's pretty clear there was a quid pro quo.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to come back just for a moment to the importance of Watergate, because Watergate wasn't just a kind of a historical artifact. Watergate I believe, had a profound effect on the perception of government and the presidency and politics that persists to this day, and really started something that has gotten worse because of events that have followed it. There was a growing cynicism, a distrust of our institutions that was compounded by decisions that have been made over the last 20 years, misinformation given to the American people, a terrible price that we've had to pay, a disruption in other parts of the world because of our decisions. And the net result of all that has been weakened institutions. The Congress is in disrespect, the media, and I don't think there's ever been a president in my lifetime, and perhaps not in the history of the United States, who is less respected than the incumbent. And the importance of this process that we're going through, however it turns out, is perhaps to try to restore some faith, respect for our institutions, and a belief that our government can work. I have more to say. I want to say something about the Constitution, but I'm going to reserve that for a little bit later.
So building off what you were just saying about the respecting of our governmental processes, what is your take on why Nixon allowed John Dean, Alexander Butterfield, John Mitchell, Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman to testify before the Senate Watergate Committee? Why did he not claim executive privilege and try to prevent this in the way we are seeing President Trump attempt to stop people from testifying today?
Well, in the first instance, I don't think Nixon had much choice. John Dean was going to testify whether Nixon claimed executive privilege or not. Executive privilege is a constitutional matter, is very complicated. But Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell testifying, they were witnesses who supposedly were friendly to the White House, and that was an attempt by the White House to get its side of the story out. I don't think it worked out that way for them, but that was the effort. But there was no way that they could prevent John Dean from testifying. He was under criminal investigation, and he was desperate to get his side of the story out, and that was the best forum for him, the best place for him to present his view. And the other thing is that executive privilege wasn't invoked on a daily basis back then. So, you know, it was really reserved for special events. And I think that perhaps I could count on one hand the number of times that I heard the phrase executive privilege prior to more recent events.
It is worth pointing out that executive privilege ceases to apply when you get into fraud and criminal activity. But I would just add that I don't think Richard Nixon in his wildest dreams would have imagined being able to assert brand new theories of privilege like this absolute privilege that Donald Trump has just sort of invented out of whole cloth to say that absolutely anything he wants to, even for people that have never worked in the White House, get to just stand down and not comply with congressional subpoenas. So we're in a brave new world, I think, when it comes to authoritarianism. And it's interesting, I think, to note that President Trump is kind of a student of Nixon. I mean, Nixon is someone that he has said he reveres, and he has spoken a lot about how Nixon could have survived Watergate had he only, done some things differently. And boy, would Nixon have loved to have Fox News back then too.
The Trump administration recently blocked U.S. Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland from testifying in front of the House Intelligence Committee about the Ukraine matter. On the same day, counsel to the president, Pat Cipollone, delivered a letter on behalf of President Trump to the Speaker of the House and the chairman of the 3 House committees leading the impeachment inquiry, stating that the executive branch would not participate in the inquiry. And by participate, I mean producing requested documents or witnesses. Do you believe that President Trump's stonewalling of the House impeachment inquiry is part of strategy to force the House to impeach him on limited evidence that they presently have, so that they can argue in the Senate trial that there is insufficient evidence to remove him from office? Or do you believe that there's another strategy or no strategy at all?
This is often the challenge with President Trump. He's either the greatest mastermind playing a type of 3-dimensional chess that none of us can really quite appreciate, or he's winging it all the time. This feels a lot more like winging it. If he is literally playing a 2-inning strategy, trying to set up an argument in the Senate that he was impeached on limited information, having created that limited information by refusing to cooperate, that's a pretty flimsy strategy, in my opinion. So no, I think this is just part of the scorched earth, refusal to cooperate, burn down the House approach that he's taken to this, and not just this, but all congressional oversight of investigations of any kind, including things in my little natural resources committee and our transportation committee. You know, we are doing full-throated oversight in all of the different standing committees of the House, and we're getting the same stonewalling.
Thank you.
So this is a question for both of you. Dan Coates, the former Director of National Intelligence, announced his resignation 3 days after President Trump's July 25th call with President Zelensky. It seems very likely that he has valuable information regarding the circumstances surrounding the call. Do you think that we will hear from him in the impeachment inquiry?
All right. You bet we will. He's a hugely important witness, and the difference between a Dan Coates and some of these clowns like Corey Lewandowski and Rudy Giuliani is that Dan Coates is a serious person who takes things like perjury seriously, and he's a truth teller and an institutionalist, and I want to believe someone who actually cares about his country a little more than whatever partisan populism others seem to be gripped by. So he's going to be a fantastic and critically important witness.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think that's basically correct.
This one is for the both of you as well. Many commentators on both sides of the issues have noted that impeachment is a political exercise rather than a legal one, which means that the public opinion plays an important role, as every vote in the impeachment and trial will be heavily scrutinized by voters. What do you see as the primary differences between the public audience of 1974 and the public audience of 2019?
Well, I think it's important to remember that in 1974 there were 3 television networks and a bunch of newspapers. There was no internet, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, and public opinion was basically shaped by what the networks chose to cover and what newspapers printed. Unlike today, when anybody basically can write anything and put it out there for other people to read, and then the only question is, how do you let people know that you've written something that you want them to look at? And as somebody who's written a blog and is writing a blog, it's a problem for me as well. But public opinion in this process, it is a political process, it's not a legal process, and public opinion is vital, and I think it's important, I'm sure the Congressman will agree, that Congress, the House and the Senate have to be careful not to get out too far in front of public opinion. During Watergate, a couple of times I spoke to the editorial board, the chief editorial writer for the Post, and who was very hesitant to call for Nixon's impeachment, even though the Post had, on a kind of a daily basis, was criticizing him and calling into question things that he had said. And he said to me, I don't want to get out in front of what the public thinks. When I think that the public is ready for impeachment, then we'll call for it. Some people may feel that he should have, as a newspaper editorial writer, he should have been out in front, and that may be. But if you don't want to lose your audience, you have to be careful. Let the evidence collect, let it bubble to the surface as it has, and then I think the public, as you can see by public opinion polls, will come around to the support of the process.
So I would say that in terms of the news and information environment now versus 1974, it is worlds apart. Everything has changed. I had a town hall Friday night, some of you were at, and one of the last questions from a Trump supporter was essentially this. It was essentially, well, you know, Hillary interfered with the 2016 election, so why is Trump inviting other countries to interfere with 2020 a problem? And she cited some blog where she gets this information. Now, this is all patently false. It didn't happen. It's not true. But that's sort of the times we're in. A certain percentage of the American people go out and find the facts and the news they want instead of the stuff that's actually true. And that, I think, was much less of a problem in 1974. I would say, remind me the first thread of that question, because I got upset by just thinking about it.
That impeachment is a political exercise.
Yes, thank you. So I hear that a lot. Well, impeachment is political, therefore, and people then take that off in all sorts of different tangents. And some people believe and have said you have to wait for public opinion to be overwhelmingly for it before you start down that road. You get into a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, whether you're a member of Congress struggling with, gosh, I took an oath to uphold the Constitution and defend our country against enemies foreign and domestic, and that doesn't mean just when it's popular with the public, or when you're a journalist and you understand that public opinion is not static, it can change, and by the way, you can help change it by getting out and leading on some of these things. So that's been kind of part of the constructive friction, I would say, certainly within the Democratic caucus all year long. Some of us believe that we should get out and lead, and we believe that this was so compelling and is such the right thing to do that the public opinion would follow. Speaker Pelosi, who I just absolutely revere, would often say, and she would quote Abraham Lincoln, public opinion is everything. Without it, you can't do anything. With it, you can do everything. And she would always say this to suggest there has to be a certain ripeness for when we go. Hard to second guess the way she's played it, because when she finally did decide it was time to move forward and put her imprimatur on the impeachment inquiry, public opinion came right along. And I don't know if public opinion would have done the same thing had we moved earlier on impeachment. But I would just say how we do this really matters. It's not always if you do it, but how you do it. And if you do it in a sober, thoughtful way, and that's one of the first talking points you're going to hear from House Democrats, is that this is not a jubilant moment, we're not celebrating anything, it's a sad moment for our country, but we have to step up and do our constitutional duty. If you do it well, and if you have these first-person witnesses, we've talked about some of them, I think public opinion will continue to shift. And those of us who have long argued that doing the right thing is also good politics, I think should be vindicated here.
To follow up on that, would you say that based on the person who supported Trump who had false information, the freedom of press granted in the Constitution actually inhibits justice from being executed in politics?
You know, I think we all, have some personal responsibility to sort out the junk from the actual facts. And I think, anyone who's really trying to get real information would never believe a story like that. So I want to have a little more faith in most of the American people that they're going to find their way to the truth and not the crazy conspiracy theory websites out there that still exist. But I'm not ready to modify the First Amendment to shut down conspiracy sites, for example. I think we're all just going to have to, take some personal responsibility with our families, and to the extent that we can be opinion leaders and bring folks back to the truth.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say one word that, for me, of course, the First Amendment is the rock on which I stand. And any attempt to try to limit speech, limit publication, is so fraught with danger because there's a wonderful line from the play about, I'm having a senior moment, about how the wind can shift and come around and blow you away. So you want to be careful about tampering with institutions that have stood the test of time, because Sir Thomas More, you start out with one intention and thinking that you're going to solve one problem, and with Murphy's Law, it turns out that you're going to create a far greater problem than the one that you try to alleviate.
Our next question is for Congressman Huffman, and then Mr. Meyer is, of course, welcome to respond. Nixon's resignation in August of 1974 was less than 3 months before congressional midterm elections. According to Ken Hughes, a Watergate authority and research specialist at the University of Virginia, the Republicans, quote, were heading into the general election, so they were worried about offending the middle, and the middle had turned against Nixon by August of 1974. Republicans in Congress realized that he was going to drag them down if he remained in office, and that made all the difference, end quote. Given that we are getting closer to the 2020 election, do you think that the Republicans in Congress will come to a similar realization that Trump will drag them down, resulting in a retreat from Trump like the one that happened to Nixon?
I keep waiting for that to happen. Our sensibilities are different, and I think one thing Trump has just done a masterful job of is dumbing down our sense of outrage, diluting the significance of any one of the abuses that he has committed and that we're trying to hold him accountable for. It's almost like his theory of defense against this impeachment is to just keep creating impeachable offenses at such a volume that we sort of get overwhelmed and lose our focus. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. At some point, will Republicans in Congress, either for their electoral needs in 2020 or just because I hope they still care about our republic, part ways with him? I think so. I think there has to be that point. But bear in mind that Nixon was far more popular than Donald Trump. And yet still here we are. So they haven't gotten there yet. They just got whacked in the 2018 midterm elections. You think that might have been a bit of a wake-up call. That didn't do it. So it's going to take a lot more than anything we saw in 1974, I think, to bring this punch around. I do think there may be a point, though, where it happens.
Well, I think there's been a profound change in the Republican Party, and in a way I sometimes think of it as the invasion of the body snatchers, and that Republicans in the Senate especially have been so mesmerized and so hypnotized by Trump that they can't lift a finger to oppose it. But I think the essence of the problem is, first of all, fear, lack of integrity and a sense of independence, and a kind of a career mentality that they'll do anything to keep their jobs, because behind them are their constituents, and this is the 40%, I suppose, of Americans who would follow Trump over the cliff if he led them there. who will oppose anyone who criticizes Donald Trump. So you have the only opposition that you hear are from retiring members of the Senate who don't have to worry about re-election. You're not seeing, kind of a muffled criticism from Mitt Romney, who is more, Trump is not all that popular in Utah, so it isn't much of a risk for Romney to speak up. And the mood in the 40% is something that I can't quite understand the level of anger and disaffection among people who show up at Trump rallies, that they don't seem to have the same values that I want to say that we have, the same respect for our institutions, and it's more like a mob than it is an informed electorate. It's not an informed electorate, it's just loyalists, and I'm not at all confident that if the House impeaches Trump and it goes to the Senate, that concerns about re-election are going to throw any votes, any significant number of votes in the Republican Party toward conviction.
I'm going to just disagree with a small part of what Larry just said. He referenced members of Congress being mesmerized by Trump. Some, yes, but I think for the most part, overwhelmingly, it's fear. It's the other thing that he mentioned, because he has created such a punishing political climate within the Republican Party right now. And even Mitt Romney, when he spoke up last week, began getting bombarded on social media and other places by these Trump trolls, and I get some too, but also Russian bots and all of these things working in concert, spreading fake news that Romney has all of these investments in Ukraine, stuff that's not true. They have made it so unpleasant and so personally terrifying for a lot of members of Congress that that's what's holding them in check. And of course, he's got several scalps, from members of Congress like Mark Sanford and others who actually did stand up to him, and he turned around and helped defeat them. So when you hold members of Congress in check just by fear, that is not a deep loyalty. And this is why I still remain a little bit hopeful that at some point, when the dynamics change a little bit, there's not a real loyalty, there's not a real affection for Donald Trump among most Republican members of Congress, and when it breaks, it'll be a jailbreak.
Well, I take your point, but the point I'm trying to make is, I know I keep reading and hearing about what members of Congress and senators, Republicans, say in private as opposed to what they say in public. If they took their oath of office seriously, they would start saying in public what they say in private.
This one is for both of you. Do you believe that President Trump's snap decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northern Syria, abandoning our Kurdish allies, is somehow connected to the impeachment crisis? In other words, do you think that President Trump is/will continue to use his power to the fullest extent to get as many things done as he can in whatever time he has left in office?
Well, I see what President Trump has done in Syria as connected to the impeachment process, because as far as I'm concerned, it demonstrates the absolute necessity to impeach him and remove him from office. What he has done in terms of turning our back on an ally that we solicited to aid us in our policy has done incalculable damage to foreign policy, the execution of foreign policy across the board. no ally of the United States can look at what happened there and in other instances and believe that as long as he's president, and maybe after he's gone, because I think the skepticism will linger, that they can rely on America's word. And our word is really vital and is an essential part of our projection of our power around the world. So I don't know if he, the question is whether he did this.
Whether it's, yeah. Whether it feeds into impeachment.
As far as I'm concerned, it does feed into impeachment, as I've indicated. Yes.
I think it does too, even though, you won't see probably a discrete article of impeachment about this, but it speaks to his unfitness to serve. And I think this is such a fiasco, and the things that are happening in Syria right now as a result of a single phone call in a matter of 48 hours, the atrocities that have already begun to happen, and then all of the ripple effects that have fundamentally shifted the power dynamic in that region to the delight of Vladimir Putin. So we have another deliverable for Vladimir Putin. At the meeting in Helsinki, which Trump tried to have a completely off-the-books conversation with Putin, didn't want anyone around, wanted to hide the interpreter's notes. We know because, thank goodness the media, somebody in the media got a picture of Vladimir Putin's notes for that conversation. Right there on his agenda list was Syria. And now we see the deliverable. This is everything Vladimir Putin could have asked for, and it's one of a very long list of deliverables from this president. So I think it's becoming harder and harder for so-called defense hawks or national security-minded Republicans to defend this president. And while it might not feed directly into impeachment, it makes it easier, I think, for members of Congress in either house to break from it.
Thank you.
Building off of that, do you think that Trump is trying to or will continue to use the power for whatever time he has left to get as many things done as possible?
When you say get anything done, you mean in a constructive way? I mean, he's had plenty of opportunity. He had both houses of Congress there. He could have done, had he not passed the largest tax cut in history, he might have had a infrastructure bill passed, and we could be dealing with our really crumbling, and you all should know this better than anyone when you drive on your highways on a daily basis. Our infrastructure is crumbling, and it's vital that we do something about it. And he could have done something about that, and he didn't when he had a golden opportunity. This man has no real agenda other than his own welfare. And apparently the 40% of the electorate that supports him, it doesn't bother them because they are so disaffected by what's happened to them that they don't care. And that is really frightening because I mentioned that I have a blog. I think that we see all the, this is really a serious moment. I see that we have the opportunity for a skillful demagogue to lead us into fascism. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we not only deal with this person in the White House, but that we get involved, get back into participation in our political system, pay attention, and shake off our complacency.
Amen. I couldn't agree more. Here's what I want to say about this idea of, will Trump try to get a bunch of stuff done? He knows he needs to change the subject right now. And so he's going to try to at least create the appearance of getting some things done, right? And that's why you saw this photo op with China just a couple days ago. He knew that the markets were jittery, that this trade war that he has kind of bumbled us into he doesn't know where it's really going or how it ends, and so he needed to create the appearance that there was some kind of a breakthrough agreement with China. Now, like so many of these photo ops that we've come to see with this president, there's no there. There actually is no agreement. This is sort of just like similar photo ops he's had with Kim Jong-un about, breakthroughs on denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, and there's no there. Or any number of events where some corporation is going to invest billions in some, critical battleground state and rehabilitate some abandoned auto plant, and, weeks later after the press cycle has passed, you come to find that's not real either. So I think we're going to see a lot of these cosmetic sort of getting things done events, and I think we are going to have to look deeper and really push back on these stunts. Now, the other thing I could sort of see the president doing, just because his brain works this way, is going to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and saying, okay, I'll do an infrastructure deal, or I'll do election integrity, or I'll do net neutrality, or any one of these things that are really popular with Democrats and with most of the people, or background checks, right, on gun violence, if you just get rid of the impeachment thing. Which is not going to happen, but I would not be surprised at all if he offers that kind of a quid pro quo.
I have an additional question for both of you. Going back to something that Congressman Huffman said, how do you think that Trump's refusal to cooperate will affect the impeachment inquiry?
So I'll start if it's okay, Larry, and I would say we're in a different place now, that we have an official impeachment proceeding with the Speaker of the House as the promoter, clear majority of the House, very comfortable moving forward. What it means is that when the executive branch simply refuses to comply, we just add another article of impeachment. That's obstruction of Congress, and it's plain as day when they do it. So that's not where we were before. The other thing that changes is that with such a clear impeachment posture, we're on our strongest footing with the courts when we have to fight it out over things like getting the president's tax returns from his accounting firm, Mazars. We just had this fight this week, and last week rather, and the executive branch argued that this stuff they're doing, it's not a legitimate legislative purpose, right? Only, I guess, this president gets to determine when Congress is acting legitimately. The court totally shut that down. And barring some last-minute save from the Supreme Court, it looks like we're going to get the tax returns, or we're going to get a bunch of financial records that could be very significant. Maybe not in time to be part of this impeachment vote that I expect to happen before the end of the year, but we're going to have to keep following all of these threads of accountability. And the lawyer in me tells me that there's something in those financial records and in those tax returns that the American people and the Congress need to see.
I should say that I agree with the Congressman. Process is vitally important. Impeachment may be a political process, but it's really important that Congress stick to the correct procedures and that the public perceive Congress doing that and proceeding in a thoughtful, careful, deliberate, respectful way, following the demands of legislation and the Constitution, and so that the outcome then has some substance, unlike what happened with President Clinton, where it was clear that this was, to my perception, I mean, I don't want to defend what President Clinton did, but it was pretty clear that this was a political vendetta, and that's one of the reasons why it blew up in the Republicans' face and why they lost a large number of seats in the House of Representatives in the election that followed. So for that reason, I think that the careful, steady approach to impeachment is really important.
Let me just clarify one part of the Mazars ruling that we got last week. I should have clarified that it was a 2-1 decision of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The one dissenting justice, a recently appointed, dubiously qualified Trump appointee, the best that she could come up with was to argue that congressional oversight and subpoenas and things like that only matter when you're in an impeachment. Okay? Well, here we are. We are in impeachment now. So even the Trump-appointed justice that was trying as hard as possible to help Trump seemed to indicate that when you're in an impeachment, yeah, you really do have to comply with all this stuff. Subpoenas matter, courts have to enforce them. So I feel pretty confident about where that takes us in some of these fights going forward.
This next question, it may be a little bit too speculative, but I'll just ask it. Do you believe that if Republican senators start to support the impeachment inquiry, will it be to keep the support of the people they represent, or because their opinions have actually changed? Because it seems rare that a senator's opinion or view would change so drastically.
I'm going to quickly answer and say it will be about political survival.
Yeah, but I don't think that's going to happen.
So at this point, I think we're moving on to audience questions.
So now we're going to be able to hear the audience questions. So, what is the strategy and timeline behind waiting to vote on impeachment?
So I'll take a whack at that. The implication from that question is that we're waiting, and I guess I would argue after waiting for 9 months to get this thing going, I feel like we're moving really fast, and I feel pretty pleased about that. So here's my understanding of the way this is going to work. We are still in the inquiry phase of this, and sometimes these little nuances, inquiry proceeding, can really matter. So we're fact gathering right now, and you're going to hear the administration and their defenders argue, oh, due process, in a criminal trial, the president would have his attorney right there, and you'd have the minority party with subpoena rights and all this stuff. If you want to analogize to a criminal proceeding, the proceeding would be a grand jury indictment and a closed proceeding where the defendant doesn't get to cross-examine witnesses. It's not all out in the public. So that's where we are right now, and it's also it has that nature because a lot of this stuff involves foreign relations and classified, potentially, information, so most of it before the Intel Committee. It's normal that this would be happening behind closed doors. When we get to the point where articles of impeachment are developed by the Intelligence Committee, and I think they will be, and I think it'll be focused primarily on this Ukraine scandal, those will then be submitted to the Judiciary Committee, and there will be a more open proceeding. And it's possible that there may be some new rules considered at that point. And back in the Watergate proceedings that Larry was covering, it is true, and you hear this today, that the Republicans, the minority party, did have subpoena rights, but those subpoena rights at that time were always subject to a majority vote of the committee, the majority being Democrats. So I have no problem with that kind of a safeguard to prevent the abuse of subpoena power. And it may be that we take a vote once we get into more of a proceeding phase before the Judiciary Committee. That will then feed into a formal vote on articles of impeachment that, if they pass out of that committee, will come to the full House and will be done, hopefully by the end of the year.
Well, as I understand the question, I want to cite, I'm not sure if it was a Chinese philosopher or Roman or Greek. Perhaps it was Machiavelli, or maybe even Groucho Marx, who said timing is everything. And I think that the way the House has proceeded under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi has demonstrated how important timing is and waiting for the right moment to act.
What comments have you heard from Republicans that indicate they might vote for impeachment?
Well, one Republican said it so bluntly that they kicked him out of the party. His name is Justin Amash, and he's now an independent. So when we talk about the fact that there's no Republicans supporting impeachment, you got to remember that just a few months ago, Justin Amash was a Republican. He was part of the most conservative caucus in the Republican Party, the Freedom Caucus, he was exiled, essentially. Now, I've heard a number of Republican colleagues say things privately, some beginning to say things publicly that suggest they're open to this. Will Hurd, in some of the public, he's retiring, he's a thoughtful guy, he's a national security intelligence kind of guy. I mean, this is right in his wheelhouse. And I think he would be a perfect example of someone that I would hope would vote with us when the time comes. I have a colleague, more conservative Republican from Illinois, John Shimkus, who's also retiring, who just last week was so appalled by Trump's Syria debacle that he said he's withdrawing his support for Trump in the 2020 re-election campaign. That gets you pretty much in play, I think, for something like an impeachment vote. So there's a couple. The cracks are starting to show, and I think, again, once the dam starts to crack, it will eventually break.
Well, there is a price to be paid. During the impeachment hearings in 1974, Congressman Larry Hogan, who was from a district right outside of Washington, D.C., Congressman Hogan was a Republican. He was going to run in the Republican primary for governor of Maryland, and he was a retired FBI agent. And he came out and stated publicly, quite eloquently, that he was supporting impeachment because he believed that President Nixon had committed high crimes and misdemeanors. Larry Hogan lost the primary to a totally non-serious candidate because the Republican voters in Maryland turned their back on him, even though he was much more well qualified to be the governor than the woman who, not because she was a woman, but because she wasn't serious, the person who won the Republican nomination. So anybody who wants to continue a career in Congress has to realize that if they defy their party and vote for impeachment, that it could be the end of their political career. Personally, John Kennedy wrote a book entitled Profiles in Courage, and that strikes me, it's more important to act with integrity than to continue to stay in office if it becomes just an empty kind of an exercise if you're not going to stand up for your principles, but we'll see what happens.
But you're saying that the retiring members of Congress will be more likely to be profiles of courage.
Oh yeah, risk-free for them. I mean, they're leaving, and I think one of the reasons why they're leaving is that they really can't stand in support of President Trump any longer, so they would rather lead public life than have to live a lie.
Here's the good news. There's a lot of retiring Republican members of Congress.
Do you think Trump will resign before getting impeached to save face? And because he's lined his pockets with Russian money?
No. It's totally out of character for him to resign in the face of a challenge like this. I think Trump's a bully. I suspect that he's also a coward. But he couldn't humiliate himself. The humiliation of resigning would be even worse than being voted out of office. I don't see any possibility that he would resign.
Well, and I would add, I don't think saving face is something that even applies to someone who's so far beyond shame that you just can't even imagine him thinking that way. But I would say this. I think Donald Trump will resign when the gig is up. when he's absolutely backed into the corner, when there's no way for him to spin his way out of it. I think the tax returns and the financial documents could be the one thing that finally puts him in that corner. And I think if and when that happens, it'll just depend on our ability to get that stuff. But if and when that happens, I think you can expect to see the pardon power used in all sorts of wild and creative ways as part of that on his way out the door.
What role will the Supreme Court play in this? Should there be an impeachment of Kavanaugh?
No. I think he lied his way onto the Supreme Court. I'm appalled at Justice Kavanaugh, but I think we got to stay focused right now. And if we get a little too drunk with the impeachment Kool-Aid, we're going to undermine the thing that really matters, which is relieving this president of the office.
I agree, but for different reasons. I think we should be careful about setting bad precedents, because as I said earlier, something that you do for one reason when it seems to be work in your favor, and I'm not sure that Kavanaugh ought to be impeached in any event, but if he were impeached, the possibility then is open that impeachment becomes just another way of getting rid of justices that you don't agree with or you don't like their rulings, and that totally defeats the lifetime appointment that the Constitution provides for.
With so many sources for news and information, and not all of them impartial or factual, what are the sources of news that both you utilize in order to stay informed?
Well, first of all, I don't think that at this moment, it's very difficult to look at any news source and be able to make a case that it's impartial, because we're so divided and so partisan right now that regardless of what anyone reads or watches, opponents will say, well, they're not impartial. Personally, I'm concerned about. Well, let me come back to that. I personally read the Washington Post. I read the New York Times. I watch MSNBC, but I'm quite aware that I'm getting a one-sided point of view. One of the benefits when we had only 3 networks was that we all were given the same set of facts. And we had to deal with those, and we didn't have silos that we could disappear into and absorb facts that suited our own personal views. And even though we might not have been getting a complete picture, at least we were all on the same page. Now we can't even agree on what the facts are, and that's really, I think, a serious problem for our public dialogue.
I struggle with this, and I think all of us should be struggling with it. I can just offer a few suggestions for those who are looking maybe to be informed and not influenced as much. I think NPR is fantastic. I think they set the right tone. It's serious, it's informational. But there's also, I found a cable news show whose motto is be informed, not influenced, and it's a little dry, and sometimes instead of all of the salacious things that excite us every day in the age of Trump, they're going to do a deep dive on drug policy. Very substantive, but it's a station called Newsy. And if you just want information and sometimes deep dives on things that are really important and that in any other time we'd all be talking about, but they get pushed, way off the front page in the age of Trump, places like Newsy, and there's probably some newspapers that are still putting out that kind of information as well.
I would just like to add that I wish we could get away from the idea that politics should be entertaining. I think that if we could be more like Canada, where the policy discussions are boring, but I think that they're a lot more rational than what we're experiencing, I think we'd be better off.
Do you think that the public would have different reactions to the Ukraine scandal if it had happened to another president?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Any other president would probably already have resigned in shame for what happened, for what we already know happened, and it would have happened quickly. So we're just in a different age, and this president has so fortified himself with the people in his cabinet, the people in his administration, the Fox News echo chamber that he's created, all of these right-wing organs and Russian bots and other things out there that the same rules don't apply to him.
I really have a hard time imagining any other president doing what Trump has done so blatantly, and then essentially admitted it and justified it in public, and trying to act as though it was okay, and that once again everybody does it, so what's the problem? I can't imagine, certainly that Barack Obama wouldn't have done it. I don't even believe that George W. Bush, much as I opposed him and his policies, he wouldn't have done it, and it's just going back. It's just way beyond the pale, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's a perfect incident to cite in an article of impeachment. It's just way outside the borders of what's permissible.
This one is a little longer. What are the consequences of not complying with a subpoena? Do executive powers really extend this far? Why does the office of the president get to not comply without consequences?
So, because when Congress is trying to enforce a subpoena against an executive branch agency, your primary enforcement mechanism is the Department of Justice, which is run by a guy named Bill Barr. Okay, you know who he is. He's Trump's personal lawyer. And so it's just not going to happen. If you can't count on the Attorney General to enforce lawful congressional process, you then have to dig into the history books and see if there are things like civil penalties and this theory of inherent contempt, which hasn't really been tried in modern history, and we're not even sure if we could do that against the executive branch. We might be able to do it against private citizens, to literally have the Capitol Police round them up and put them in a room somewhere and assess civil penalties, but doing it against the executive branch when the executive branch is in this open contempt mode is what takes us into this constitutional crisis that we're in. And so some of this is going to have to be resolved by the Supreme Court. And I think Trump probably feels like he's got the winning hand there because he's just stacked a bunch of cronies onto the Supreme Court. We'll see. I think, again, I mentioned this Mazur's opinion coming out of the D.C. Circuit. That thing is a tight legal opinion. And I think even this Supreme Court will struggle to find a way to tell Donald Trump that these rules just don't apply to him.
Well, I said earlier that I wanted to say something about the Constitution, and I think this is the moment that I want to say it. Congressman mentioned the Attorney General, and this is a perfect example. William Barr, think about him, and then think about Elliot Richardson, who was the Attorney General when Nixon appointed him. He was his last Attorney General until he resigned when he wouldn't fire the special prosecutor when Nixon ordered him to do it. The Constitution has all kinds of restrictions and prohibitions and demands, but it's not a self-enforcing document. The Constitution depends, and the survival of our democracy depends on the integrity of the men and women who are there to carry out its obligations and its instructions. And if we don't have people of character and integrity in those positions, then we're all in trouble. And I'm afraid that at this particular moment in our history, that we're quite near the edge.
I want to add one thing to that, because I do agree. But at a time when calling for people of character and integrity seems almost naive, one thing I think about a lot is, after we get through this experience, what are the norms that we're going to have to codify? Because we probably shouldn't have to count that much on the better angels of people who will be tempted and corrupted. We're probably going to have to pass some laws with some real teeth to address situations we never thought we'd need to. And I think we're going to have to really take stock of all the different ways in which the Trump presidency has revealed those deficiencies.
This is also a longer one. Some prominent Republicans are claiming that Joe Biden, when he was vice president, used his influence to remove Ukraine's top prosecutor, who was investigating the energy company for which Biden's son sat on the board. These Republicans say that Biden's actions were the same as Donald Trump's recent action. With Ukraine, and therefore an impeachment of Trump is unjust. How do you respond?
Well, first of all, there's no evidence that's been presented to back up that allegation, number one. And to the contrary, it has been investigated and proven not to be true. So this is a kind of a false claim, and it's really just a smokescreen in order to confuse the issue.
Let me see if I can put a finer point on that. This argument that Joe Biden was out there freelancing for his son flies in the face of the fact that what he did when he went to Ukraine and insisted on these reforms was the official position of the United States State Department, of our entire foreign policy apparatus, of all of our allies, our NATO allies, of the European Union. So unless you believe this was one heck of a conspiracy for Hunter Biden to make money, there's really no there. So I want to contrast that to what Donald Trump did in the Ukraine, which was to go against the position of all of our allies that we needed to get this critical existential relief to Ukraine at this crisis as Putin continues to attack them in the eastern Ukraine. And he was freelancing to help Rudy Giuliani and some of his clients. In fact, the biggest difference is Trump had to clear away all of the professional diplomats. Why did we even have Rudy Giuliani involved in this? He doesn't even work for the United States government. Why did we have to sideline the actual ambassador to Ukraine, Yavin, I can't pronounce her name. She testified yesterday, apparently. A serious career diplomat. Why did we have to push her out of the way and then bring in this Sondland guy who was the EU ambassador, doesn't know anything about Ukraine, and make him on point with Rudy Giuliani? He's a Republican donor. He's not a career diplomat. He's a political hack. So there are just enormous differences. These are apples and oranges. It is hard to convince a Trump supporter, in 30 seconds, because there's a lot of facts that have to be laid out. But I think any of you who are looking to understand why the Biden thing, however you may feel about kids trading on their parents' titles to make money, which, kind of doesn't smell right. Biden didn't do anything wrong. Biden was carrying official U.S. policy, official NATO, official EU policy into that meeting, and that's why it stands totally distinct from what Trump did with Giuliani and Son.
What can be done to moderate the cynicism on the political extremes to rebuild confidence in our political system?
Well, I think that we, as individuals, have to realize our obligation, as I said before, to participate in the system, get involved, support candidate on one side or on the other side, and insist on a rational process and reward candidates who are constructive and work to defeat candidates who aren't. That's at least the beginning. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done, but you have to begin somewhere, and I think that's something that each and every one of us can do. I have to confess that in 2012 and in 2008, I went out and worked for Barack Obama in the primary in 2008 and in the general election in 2012. And on election day, I went out with a friend of mine and we rang doorbells and put door hangers on people's doors if they weren't there. And we worked for about 4 or 5 hours, which was our tour. And we went home. And I said, well, what good did any of that do? It just felt as though I had done really nothing of value. And when I turned on the television that night to watch the returns come in and Obama beat Mitt Romney, there was a widespread claim that what had won the election for Obama was the ground game, which is what my friend and I had been participating in. And we were 2 persons among 1 million, let's say. But there were 1 million of us. And you look at this group that's here today, each one of us is an individual. But together we can be a mighty force.
That's a pretty good answer. I would just add, if you need examples of why elections matter and why your involvement and resisting cynicism is so important, just look at 2018. We wouldn't be having this conversation if we hadn't seen a big blue wave election that gave the House to the Democrats. That enabled Mueller to actually complete his report. It enabled us to bring forward these facts. We wouldn't have ever heard from this whistleblower, because we know for a fact that this whistleblower complaint was shut down by the White House and the Attorney General, and it was only when it came over to Chairman Adam Schiff that it came to light. So elections matter in a big, big way, and 2018 is a great reminder of that. I'll just throw one other suggestion if you want to fight cynicism, and that is work on election integrity. People need to understand that our elections are accurate and that we can count on them, and take seriously these things like election interference.
I think fighting cynicism is probably the best note to end on this evening. So I want to first thank Larry Meyer and Congressman Huffman for being here. And how about a hand for Luke and Sophie? And for Bella? And for all of the rest of the students who played a big part in organizing this, we could not have done this without them, and for Mike Fargo as well. seeing you again at Red Academy for more events like this soon. Thanks for coming out.